Welcome to Theology, a show dedicated to apologetics, discussions, interviews, debates, and more. The hosts are Catholic, but also welcome charitable conversations with Orthodox, Protestants, and non-Christians. And welcome to the Reason to Theology show, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Friday evening. Pleased to announce we have a returning guest, Dr. Matthe Minerd, and he is going to be doing a lecture for our R&T lecture series on the Prima Pars. This is one of 4, so expect 3 more. And also Dr. Minerd is going to be on talking about other things as well, but we're going to be doing these basically one every other week, if I recall correctly. So right around the same time on Fridays, so everybody can kind of look forward to that. Again, we're engaging the Prima Pars of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologiae. So we'll be talking about, can we know that there is a God? Is there a God? Is God one? Is he good? Is he holy? Things like that. So that's what we have to look forward to. And of course, for anybody not familiar, Dr. Minerd is a professor of philosophy and moral theology at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary of St. Cyril and Methodius in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He is also the author of a new book here, The Order of Things, The Realism of the Principle of Finality, which is available on emmausacademic.com. And it's a translation of some of the works of Gertrude Lagrange, and it also has some commentary. And I'll let Dr. Minerd maybe give a little bit more of an introduction to the book, if you don't mind, if you want to tell them a little bit more about it.
Sure, yeah, I'll do that, and then just, I guess, jump into the lecture.
Jump in, yeah.
The text is just actually is a translation of The Realism of the Principle of Finality, which was a book by Gertrude. It actually is some essays of his that he sort of stapled together and then wrote a first section for. But I tell the tale of that in the introduction. So it's just coming out. It's, of course, available from Amazon and other places. But Emmaus Academic does do good work for the St. Paul Center. So it's always nice to give them a slightly better cut than Jeff Bezos's cut.
Right.
So, may I just go ahead and begin?
Yeah, jump in. Absolutely.
Yeah, so next 4 lectures I'm going to be doing are on the Prima Pars of Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. We'll just call it the Summa, setting aside the question of the Summa contra Gentiles, which is one of his other significant multi-volume works that kind of does a cohesive story of theology, kind of apologetics against the Muslims is how it was written, actually, historically, the Summa contra Gentiles. But in today's lecture, I want to lay out a little bit of the structure of the Summa Theologiae so that we can understand what's going on in the Prima Pars. And then we're going to probably for this week, and even then more so the next lecture, be discussing topics that fall to the treatise on God. Now, sometimes people split that into the treatise on the one God and the treatise on the triune God, but I'll discuss that here in a little bit about the nature of those sets of divisions. And then I'll occasionally have to wet my whistle as I'm lecturing here.
No worries.
All right, well, let's go ahead. Let's actually just talk about the Summa, because it's important anytime that you're reading a work to approach it with the same intellectual light as the author who has written it. You need to have yourself within the same, we could say, hermeneutic perspective, the same interpretive perspective, but even more profoundly, within the same subjective disposition as the author has written. Because you have to ask yourself, what kind of knowledge are you eliciting? Are you performing in this particular discipline? Famously, St. Thomas, well, somewhat famously, St. Thomas begins the Summa Theologiae by saying that he's looking around the texts that he's had to use as a teacher, and it's kind of a vexing scenario for him that there are all of these repetitions in the ways that topics are being treated. Now, of course, in his day, at the universities of Paris and Oxford, and then to a degree at the Studia as well, for the orders, especially the Mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, but above all at the universities, you would follow Peter Lombard's sentences, selections drawn from the Fathers, a 4-volume series that became really the driving textbook of theological studies in the Latin West, all the way up until, the 16th century. And St. Thomas was thinking, well, the way that this is written, and perhaps whatever other texts happen to be in use at the Dominican studia he was teaching at aren't cohesive enough for laying out the topics in theology. They tend to repeat too many things. They revisit things. And so he says, well, beginners need to have this nicely ordered curriculum. Now, to any reader who approaches St. Thomas's text, and I can say this as a professor as well, although at the Byzantine seminary, I don't teach the Summa per se, but having done this for undergraduates in former days, back when I was an adjunct elsewhere, you can't teach the Summa and think that it has, it can be just picked up today. It was written for students who had already been very much tutored or very much taught the whole world of Aristotle's basic works, as well as the developed logic of the Middle Ages before they even started their theological studies. So the beginners here are, of course, almost like graduate students entering their theological studies. They've also probably done some scriptural studies and other theological studies along the way up to this point as well. Well, let's sit back and think what theology is on St. Thomas's account. Here, I will openly admit that I'm going to be mixing together in everything else that I say in this lecture my own sort of synthesis from the Thomist school that I've, I guess mixed together somewhat. But it's important to see that Thomism is not merely a dead letter of, and I'm so occasionally pointing to my second monitor here, the Summa. I have just pulled up here kind of the outline. It's not merely the words of St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae, but rather the entire approach to theological science that was given birth in the Dominican order from this text. And it took some time for that to develop. Theology and the assent, the type of intellectual assent that is given in theological science, is distinct from faith. Now that sounds strange. And there's a danger, no doubt, in saying that you would detach theology from faith. But that is, of course, not St. Thomas's position. From top to bottom, the Summa Theologiae is looking to give an intellectus fidei, some understanding, and that word's going to be important, of the faith. We could say that faith is a supernatural virtue, a theological virtue, an infused virtue that puts us in touch with the very knowledge that God has of himself and of all that he creates. Faith is a far more personal kind of assent to the truths revealed by God. In the stylized language of the scholastics of later days, primarily the character of faith is to bring about assent, whereas theology looks to explain. Theological science, therefore, is the rational and discursive attempt to understand the true meaning of what is revealed, as well as the interconnection between the mysteries of faith, the way that they can be defended against those who deny them, be they complete non-believers or those who are heretics and don't hold the truths of faith as a whole or in part, as the Catholic Church does. Or also, too, to draw certain conclusions from what's known through faith. I don't like to say new conclusions, but in a sense they are. For example, just to get an idea about this, the Thomist school explains the idea of infused moral virtues, or Thomists fought for a long time over predestination with certain Jesuit thinkers. Or also, too, at least in St. Thomas's own thought, although some Thomists have critiqued this position, St. Thomas held that Christ had infused knowledge of all things. As incarnate, that is, that the incarnate Christ had this kind of knowledge. All of these kinds of conclusions are not de fide conclusions. They're not the sorts of things that are revealed and that we're called to believe on supernatural faith. The church can, in certain cases, teach them as religious truths that are to be given assent because the magisterium teaches them. But these conclusions are, strictly speaking, scientific deductions that occur within theology. and it takes the full force of the reasoning to prove them. And that's what's different, you see, about theology. A theological conclusion will always have this feeling about it that you're agreeing with it because you understand the reasoning that's involved. And this actually applies to all of the various things that are known in theology. It's just most clear in its scientific conclusions. Now, I'm peppering over some very important topics here about how theology is, in particular, a form of wisdom, according to the Aristotelian schema of modes of knowledge. I have an essay on my website, I link off to it, that might be of interest actually here. And it's important not to reduce theology merely to its scientific applications. So I just want to make sure that I've made that clarification, even though I may at times use the language of theological science, because that's kind of the typical language one finds in scholastic authors, and I'm going to tend to slip into it. But the language means basically that what the theologian does, according here to Aquinas, is that unlike just merely believing through faith, the theologian looks to explain that which he believes. But that means, if we're careful, that theology is a lower discipline than faith, and I'll make some brief mention here in a moment of mystical experience as well. Because theology takes its root in the theological virtue of faith. Without the theological virtue of faith, theology would not have the principles, those de fide, those on-faith truths revealed and proposed by the church, that then underlie everything else that theology does. Theology may strengthen one's faith, but faith remains the root source of theological discussion and reflection. What's moreover the case, there is of course a higher sort of wisdom, and it's a wisdom that is moved ultimately by the theological virtue of charity, the mystical experience that is spoken of by great spiritual authors. Here we're speaking of, again, a kind of supernatural knowledge of God. Faith and theology, they also are a supernatural mode of knowing. This is the true grandeur of theology, according to St. Thomas, actually. But also a supernatural knowledge of God that knows God in the most apophatic sort of way by experiencing in an almost unmediated fashion God's activity within the soul, especially God moving the soul through love, which itself becomes a kind of formal mode of cognition. That is a way of knowing that love passes over to become the objective means for knowing God. This is mystical experience on the Thomist account. Above all, in the gift of the Holy Spirit, known as the gift of wisdom. So, we have three wisdoms. One can say there's the natural wisdom of philosophy, the wisdom of theology, and the wisdom of the Holy Spirit. But the latter two put their roots down into the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Okay, now, having said that, and realizing that if this were a different a different day in a different location, I would have to drink bourbon because I'm simplifying things far too much. So I must drink my sorrows away. So I always tell my students this whenever I'm simplifying things. Let's consider the structure of theological knowledge so that we can then think of the various treatises and what St. Thomas is doing. And this is what I'm about to say is very important. So allow me to first tip my hat to something that you probably all know of. Looks like I nicked my finger here and I picked a scab off, so I apologize. I'll have to keep my hand down on the video, at least for those of you who are watching the video. So anyway, it's important to tip my hat to a classical account of St. Thomas because it's his own words, but then I need to carry forward a little bit of what's going on in the Summa Theologiae structurally in each of the treatises, or the treatises all bound together as a whole. So classically, because of St. Thomas's own words, the Summa is presented on the model of its Neoplatonic language, right? The Platonists who come in the era after the end of the Platonic school, of God going forth and returning, exitus and reditus, and giving the way for the return in Christ. And so the first part of the Summa would be about God himself and his creation of all things. You would have the moral part giving you man's return to God, and the way of that return is Christ. It's fine. St. Thomas basically uses this model himself at the beginning of the text. But the deepest structural point, and if you see this, you'll really understand how to read the Summa and to see what he's doing and what he's not doing, because he really is, in a sense, simplifying the technicalities that are involved so that he can get all of this done. He wants to lay out theology in a truly scientific manner. Now go read my essay if you want to see the stuff that worries me a little bit about this language. But he wants to follow Aristotle's posterior analytics. Now, there's the possibility that this may sound, I'm going to have to go over something that some people know, but I think it's important to see this so that this does not confuse people who don't understand the importance of this point. Aristotle's works of philosophy include, very importantly, his organon, his treatment of the instrument of reason, logic. Now, it's funny that Aristotle, who sees himself as almost having to do the investigations to invent logic, he says this in one text at one point, doesn't, however, consider logic to be part of philosophy. Very strange. It's merely the instrument of philosophy. And this will differentiate him somewhat from, for instance, Stoic thinkers. But in the Arabic world in particular, and then moreover in the Latin Middle Ages, which was highly influenced by Arab Aristotelianism, as a number of the good folks who graduate from the University of St. Thomas down in Houston can tell you. A number of people have studied there under Dr. Hauser, and I'm trying to think also, I should be able to think of the other name. Well, there's Dr. Richard Taylor who does work with him, but he's up at Marquette. The Latin Middle Ages are deeply, deeply indebted to a number of both Middle Eastern Arabs as well as Andalusian, Spanish, we might say, Arabs, for their understanding of Aristotle. And the big thing that becomes an almost obsession is the consideration of science, the posterior analytics. You see, Aristotle has his first analytics, the prior analytics. Of course, other works too in the logical corpus, but the prior analytics is about what we might say, again, kick back a bourbon because I'm simplifying, but it's about the formal validity of our reasoning. We could say it's logic that applies to everything. But there are very important other treatises. There's his sophistical refutations. What are sophistical arguments? Arguments that look like they are true but are not. There's the topics on dialectical reasoning, arguments where you can argue on one side or the other. Very important, actually, for a number of, it's actually the style of the Summa's objections follow this somewhat, but it's important for coming to the knowledge of definitions of things, for instance. But the posterior analytics is not merely about what is a valid argument, and we can't say a sound argument is what they're worried about here, because it's not modern logic, but the posterior analytics, the second analytics, is concerned with what makes a discourse scientific. What makes something a certain and proper explanation of the very principles of the subject matter isolated to be discussed. So here is where we find the discussion of first principles and how they're known, the ways that you can and, quite importantly, cannot argue for first principles. A very long definition in the second half about the nature of definition of the terms in a science. What is the role of properties and finding a property that exactly matches the essence of something? A characteristic that is proper only to this thing, but which flows from its essence, somewhat like rationality, being artistic, being social and political, are all properties that flow from the essence of what it is to be human. And the study of philosophical anthropology will discuss the way that these properties are related to each other. how it is that, for example, our social nature as humans is explained by our rational nature, how that property kind of comes first and illuminates what we can say then about our social nature. And then our social nature could be broken down into the properties thereof. So what is it to speak of natural social bond versus natural social bonds like the family and the state versus conventional social bonds, such as, bowling clubs, I suppose. So the example that I use, even though it no longer applies to anyone, I'm not sure why I use it. But the point is that this way of ordering discussions becomes incredibly important, really, through the rest of the Middle Ages. I mean, it goes down to the point of Galileo. It's going to influence even Galileo, who's lecturing on, in line, we'll say, with the posterior analytics kinds of discussions. I mean, this just goes on. And it becomes a huge question how this applies to matters of faith after the time of Aquinas. Everyone starts niggling about this after Aquinas. And you cannot but read William of Occam's beginning. He's a Franciscan in the 14th century, right? The great master of the nominalists. His beginning of his treatise, his commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences, without seeing there this big introduction on the nature of theology as a science. So this becomes very important. Father Christian Kappas, your readers will know, my boss, I guess, too, but he does work on this in the Byzantine world. It's very interesting to see how some of these discussions took place, too, in 14th century and 15th century Byzantium. But it gets hidden a little bit here in Aquinas' text. But it's there and completely operative, and it explains certain things. So let's consider now the very general breakout of the Summa Theologiae. You have a first volume, as it's always presented, the Prima Pars, the first part. And just, very interestingly today, and I'm sure I've seen this before, but I was looking at my, it's over there on my shelf now. I thought I saw it on my desk. I have breakout charts of the Summa. Like this English edition I have has all of these little charts. Now, of course, when I need them, they don't come up. All of these little charts that break out the order of the questions and what St. Thomas is doing. But I have something that actually breaks out even the whole Summa that was put together by, I believe it was Father Berthier, who wrote an excellent text on the De Locis Theologicis, but that's an aside. But he has a first overview, and he says the Prima Pars is De Deo. That's it. It's on God. And we'll come back to that in a second. I think that's a very important insight. St. Thomas clearly sees, and let's dive right into the Prima Pars, although I want to make sure today that I discuss the other treatises, and I'll explain why. But let's dive in for a second. St. Thomas, in the Prima Pars, the first part of the Summa, has a little introduction about sacred doctrine. He then discusses God as one and three. We'll come back to this. I'm going to make some distinctions and discuss this today so that we have some structural principles here to understand how some people interpret this a little bit differently than how I'm presenting it here, and that's okay. But he presents God as one and three in a very important section, or a very important, we'll say, line of division in the Prima Pars. As he comes to the end of the 43rd question involved in his treatment of the Trinity, in the midst of his treatment of the Trinity. So this is the 43rd question going along, 1, 2, 3 from the beginning. He treats the missions of the divine persons, the sending of the divine persons through grace to rational created beings. It's actually a very important topic that then should be incorporated much later in one's discussions of spiritual theology as well. So the divine missions, the sending of the second and third person of the Trinity. And at this moment, he shifts from discussions of God himself to creation, and then the distinction of creatures, the angels, the creation of matter, man, who is the combination of matter and spirit, and then God's providence and governance of creation. It's a very important moment in the Summa. And someone great theologian, a great Thomist theologian, Father Bonino, makes this point in his De Deo Uno, huge book, where he says, at this moment, between the end of the treatise on the Trinity, which we're going to discuss that language in a second, but the treatise on the Trinity, the missions of the divine persons, question 43, and question 44 on creation and the causality involved in creatures, we have a shift within the Prima Pars, which Father Bonino says even is perhaps the most important shift of the whole Summa, from what the Greek fathers would refer to as theology, in the sense of the study of God himself and the economy, the study of the economy of salvation and the actions of God in all things. It's actually very important to notice this. Now, let's use an example that I think is very important for those who might be tempted to treat the Summa as a diving, or like a pool to dive into, to go grab philosophical arguments out of. It's very tempting to read the Summa Theologiae and say, I can get so much philosophy out of here. Because he uses so much philosophy. But someone who knows Aristotle's corpus, someone who's read most Dominican approaches to St. Thomas's philosophy, will recognize something strange about the order of the treatises that I just mentioned whenever we start descending down into the economy. The Summa goes here in the Prima Pars from the angels down through the creation of matter to a discussion of man, who is spirit and matter. This order makes great sense if we're coming from God to creatures, because we're studying a discipline that is primarily about God and only secondarily concerned with creatures in relation to him. But philosophically, if one were to treat of immaterial beings, even the immateriality of the human soul, you would have to choose instead to slowly but surely, in a developed manner, yes, but along the lines of Aristotle's De Anima, his treatise on the soul, travel the pathway upward from mere vegetative life, the kind of life that is ensouling of plants, to sensation, which is the first case of knowledge, very important moment in philosophical reasoning to see the difference between one way of receiving forms, as happens in plants, and a different way that happens whenever you have knowledge. And then that could be used as the entree point to get yourself perhaps to a discussion of intellectual knowledge. And particularly in the case of Christian philosophers, because of the assurance we have because of faith, you could then even continue to go on to discuss purely immaterial beings. Some Neoplatonists did do this, expanding on Aristotle. But the path, which is going to have to play out by means of analogy, by means of a very careful, studied way of showing how things are same and different, will go upwards from our first experience of created, sensible beings, material beings, and only slowly but surely reach some knowledge of immateriality, the immateriality of the soul, the immateriality of the activities of our soul. It's very hard, because of the nature of our embodiedness, our embodied intellect even, to understand the spiritual capacities that we have. The great gift of Christianity is that it allows even the simplest of believers to know things that Aristotle was frustrated with at the end of the De Anima. He ends his On the Soul somewhat frustratingly not knowing what to do about the intellect. And this created great problems historically, because people never quite know, does Aristotle think that there's one intellect that we all share? Or do we each have our own intellectual capacity? There's a wonderful book in the Marquette series of lectures called, I think it's Aristotle's Divine Intellect or something of this sort, that investigates this in a very open and easy way, in my opinion. Relatively easy way. My wife always reminds me, that I take some things for granted here. But the point of my remark is that we should see something going on structurally here. We're descending downward in a way that's theological in the Summa Theologiae. We're not functioning philosophically. Now, what does that mean about the philosophy that's in the Summa? It means that philosophy, yes, if we may use hackneyed expressions, is the handmaid of theology. St. Peter Damian, if I'm correct on this in my memory, was the one who used this expression first. Philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. And this is used by those who are students of the Middle Ages as though it's a great thing for philosophy. Peter Damian meant to say this as an insult. Philosophy is the mere handmaiden of theology. The monks were scandalized at this growing interest in philosophy and its role in theology. The Orthodox to this day feel the same concern. Here, I find myself somewhat in agreement, strangely, because of certain partisan attachments I have, to the thought of Etienne Gilson, famous Thomist who did many great historical studies, but he has this line that he uses in a memoir of his where he refers to the truths of philosophy are like the water that becomes wine at Cana. Well, a better way to articulate that, and I'm sure he would himself, is that philosophy and even created notions get taken up in our knowledge of theology as instruments, and they're traversed by a higher power because they're going to be based on principles that are held supernaturally through the theological virtue of faith. And that will color everything. Let's consider an example of how this happens even at the level of faith, and then that enters into theology rather quickly. In the third part of the Summa, St. Thomas and other theologians then who follow his structure eventually discuss, among other things, after discussing the redemptive incarnation, the sacraments, because the sacraments are the remote instruments of Christ's humanity by which he applies the fruits of the incarnation through the rest of time. Our salvation is made present through them that way. When we speak of the sacraments as signs, and we must actually speak of them as signs, even as Catholics, we find ourselves, however, faced with this great mystery that here we have signs that also effect the grace that they signify. Where has one ever seen such things? Or when if it so exists, and I'll explain that a little bit later perhaps, the Treatise on the Church, it is a separate treatise. It's part of the Treatise on the Incarnation, or it comes after the discussion of the Incarnation, for the Church is the mystical body of Christ. When we speak in the Treatise on the Church about the Church being a sacramental society, a supernatural society, sacramental in her nature, well, how strange is that notion of society now? Society, which had been, in our own experience, it's a moral bond. It is real, for societies are the glued together composite of many individuals attempting to bring about some common good that directs their activity. But the mystical body of Christ is a single organic whole, traversed by the spiritual energy of the incarnation now present, even today, in the church. How greatly these notions have been elevated. And this is the reason why it begins with someone like Father Ambrose Gardet at the beginning of this century and Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange at the beginning of the 20th century, but even more so Cardinal Journet, Charles Journet, and Jacques Maritain, and also too, though, Jean-Hervé Nicolas in the 60s, it leads them to speak of a super analogy of faith, that faith and theology must involve analogies that are not merely, of course, reason going up to truths of faith. That doesn't make any sense because truths of faith are revealed. But instead, there's nothing opposed to the use of these. Reason is not opposed to them being picked up, these analogies of society, of sign, and elevated for loftier uses whenever they are used in the propositional content that underlies what is revealed through supernatural faith. So it's so wonderful to always remember that developed point of how philosophy is wholly traversed by the fact that the hand of faith and theology is writing with the philosophical pen, and how our notions must be elevated. And so when we speak in this treatise on God later on next lecture of the unity of God, for instance, the unity of God is a notion that even in a way, but hiddenly, for the people of Israel, and even as we're discussing it in theology, contains within it also the triunity that will be developed whenever we then discuss the distinction of the persons. The unity of God, theologically understood, is infinitely loftier than the philosophical understanding of the unity of God. If you ever have a chance to read Journet's work on the nature of sacred theology, there are beautiful pages devoted to this difference. When the words goodness are used, like goodness and beauty are used of God by a philosopher, they pale in comparison to what is known through faith, when those same words and same notions are then elevated and used in this supernatural manner. Okay, so we got philosophy being instrument here. So let's now very, very quickly just say now what we're going to do with these other two treatises that exist, but we can't treat. But I would like to invite the listener to always remember their importance, and actually, to be honest, to remember the theological importance of the second treatise, the second big, massive portion of the Summa Theologiae, namely the Secunda Pars. It's so large that it's broken up into the Prima Secundae and the Secunda Secundae. So we have, and we're going to discuss its breakout here just a little bit more as I draw to a close today, the Prima Pars, on God, on the distinction of creatures. But we have the story of man's return to God, beginning here in an important way in the Secunda Pars, because it's considering human freedom as taken up by the beatitude of God. For a great hinge of theology on the Thomist model is God's beatitude. For to study, and this is actually the hinge point between the discussion of God as one and God as three in the Prima Pars. To study God is to study bliss in itself that will be the same bliss we participate in the hereafter. And in Christ, that bliss is communicated through the grace of union to the human nature of Christ, although not directly. You have to have a discussion of the created grace in Christ's soul and all these sorts of other things. But the bliss is communicated to Christ, and then through him, through what will be called by theologians his capital grace. His grace as head of the church to all of us. But the Secunda Pars discusses human freedom as energized by the beatitude toward which we are called in grace. And that's why the very first and most important treatise of the Secunda Pars in the Summa Theologiae is the treatise on beatitude. It's so important that Father Santiago Ramirez wrote, I believe it's a 5-volume series on beatitude, 2,500, 3,000 pages. I forget how long it is. His commentary on the treatise on beatitude. Very important treatise, even though it's small. For what it does is that it lays out, already anticipating what will be said later in the treatise on grace, the discussion of the new law, the fact that we are called to divinization as children of God, that we are given in grace the divine life, that is the same life as that as the Trinity, though participated in by us. We don't have the comprehensive knowledge and love of God that he has for himself. This theme is what will animate, for instance, the distinction between essence and energies for Palamite theologians, which I've discussed here in previous lectures. And then the Secunda Pars is, in its first portion, devoted to a discussion of the main principles of the moral life. We could think kind of abstractly. So we have a discussion of human acts in general, a discussion of conscience, a discussion of, and that's a treatise that grew with the passing of time, actually. We have a discussion of the passions, because the passions are involved as principles of human actions. We then have a discussion of habitus, or habits as it's sometimes called, but the qualities of soul that will be deployed then later on in this section on morality. So to understand what it means to speak of having habits in the soul, that would be theological virtues, moral virtues, infused moral virtues, etc. Then there's a discussion only then of the general principles of vice and sin. Can't do this until you've spoken of virtue. The treatise on habit you could think of as almost being a treatise on virtues in general. And then, having discussed the principles of our acts, we can then discuss how they have an extrinsic measure, either in law, and the beautiful treatise, right, where you have not merely the discussion of the natural law, but all of the discussion of the old law and the new law as well, and as also to human law, be it civil or ecclesiastical. And then the treatise on grace, with which the Prima Secundae comes to its end, but it's one of the finest flowers that does eventually expand quite greatly if you think of Father Garrigou-Lagrange's treatise on grace in the later scholastics, very short in Aquinas, but it basically bookends the great discussion of Beatitude now, to understand our subjective appropriation of the objective bliss that we are called to. And then the Secundae, the second half of the second, goes into the particular virtues. So for this reason, historically, morality, be it actually philosophy or theology actually, in the Catholic world, came to be increasingly discussed as the general morality that one finds in the Prima Secundae, or the special or specific morality that is discussed in the Secunda Secundae. To understand this, I think it's easiest to see it this way. If we consider, above all, the treatise on human acts and on the virtues or habits, those treatises, and sin actually, those treatises deal with the characteristics, the properties that apply to virtue as such, to vice and sin as such, not to this or that kind of sin, but the properties that match the very essence of what sin is, the very essence of what virtue is, the divisions and properties of each of those general principles. Whereas then you can go on and talk about particular virtues and particular sins and their own properties that match them. Here you see a good example of that posterior analytics outlook driving what Aquinas is doing. I assure you, this is not just me making this up. It's not spoken of enough, but it really unlocks how one can read the Summa. That what you have here is a very orderly discussion that says, let's do the general properties before we do the specific ones. And it really shines forth as in an example like that there. So then the Secunda Secundae discusses the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, followed by the cardinal virtues and all of their many associated virtues as well. Justice, fortitude, or courage, temperance, of course, prudence at the very head of that I forgot. Very important discussion. Prudence is long forgotten virtue that would shed much light on the stupid things that are said by certain ecclesiastics about conscience nowadays. And then also, there's a section at the end about basically the states of life. That could be expanded. It ends up covering mostly things that pertain to clerical states of life, to be honest. But that could be expanded, for instance, to discuss the state of life of the laity. This is also a place that one could discuss state of life questions that go along with somewhat of politics and the Christian life, although that's going to spill over into the third part as well, interestingly enough. So what's the third part? although I could say so much more about this, I got to keep moving so I can get back to the Prima Pars. The Tertia Pars is about Christ. Now let's stop for a moment and let's be honest. Let's perhaps even, acknowledge here the oddity and, I don't want to say weakness, but the potential pitfalls of this approach to scientific theology. Our Protestant brethren would say, and there are even Catholic brethren who would say this, and some great thinkers at the beginning of the 20th century, even before even thinking of who would say this today, where has Christ been in all of this? For is he not the one who reveals the face of the Father? Is not Christ the only means by which we see and understand the mystery of the Trinity, some small amount? And is not the mystery of the Church a locus for the revelation of the mystery of the Godhead treated in the first part? And here we see what one might say is an extension of what was called in some circles, and I'm probably butchering the history a little, but charismatic theology, a theology that's devoted to ultimately the preaching of the mysteries. Because the preacher knows the most organic way to raise faith is to see the revelation of the miracles, or the mysteries through Christ. That Christ is indeed the way, truth, and the revelation even of our life. St. Thomas, because he sees theology, interestingly enough, as a derivative, mental habitus, ability, light. He sees all of the ordering as almost being flipped on its head. He presupposes faith. He presupposes in his hearer an active and engaged spiritual life that treasures each of the words of the creed as though it is the meaning of his or her life, the person who meditates on it, because it is. Because the creeds really reveal to us the life of God, which is our life, lived through grace. And he presupposes thus also too meditation upon Christ and the church and the lived experience of the liturgy and the sacraments. But then says, what notion explains another notion? What revealed truth explains another revealed truth? And ultimately, the most profound meaning of the incarnation is, of course, the person of the Word. And to understand the person of the Word, we would have to have somewhat articulated Trinitarian theology and a theology of the missions, the divine missions, to understand fully then, later on, the incarnation. And in order to understand the incarnation, we have to presuppose everything that goes on in the moral life so we can understand and articulate. And remember, it's the articulation that's important here. The nature of Christ incarnate as most perfect man. So this is why St. Thomas ends up having the incarnation so late, not because he undervalues the incarnation, but rather because he sees that in Christ, there's a sense in which all these truths converge. Then they explode out through the whole rest of this Tertia Pars, which was unfinished by Aquinas. He died before finishing it. And here we have a discussion of the redemptive incarnation and the mysteries of Christ's life. We have the sacraments then, in general, followed by a discussion of all the various sacraments. Then also, there should be a treatise on the last things, because then you have the fulfillment of what Christ's redemption eschatologically contains already, and then also points toward as the final fulfillment of the whole order of the economy discussed in the Tertia Pars. Historically, there had to be an add-on here, and I do think the add-on is necessary. There are one person I'm thinking of in particular, who's very dear to me, who disagrees with me, who say that there is no need for a special treatise on the church. This is a modern problem. This is something that's dealt with by these ecclesiologists who want to have a special discipline split off on its own. But it's not really something that goes for Aquinas. He presupposed ecclesiology. He presupposed his theology of the church. Well, here I'll tip my hat a bit, although it probably has its antecedents, though, to, of all people, Cardinal Biot, or some people might know him as Bilot. He was a conservative cardinal who, in the end, is not a pure Thomist, but was incredibly influential at the Gregorianum, a desirous conservative Thomist, but he had his fights over certain political matters with the pontiff in his days. But we need not visit that now. But it became very crystallized in his work on ecclesiology, at least as I understand the history, to clearly connect ecclesiology to the treatise on the Incarnation, which I've already hinted at. Because ecclesiology treating the mystical body of Christ would make sense as either part of or just after the immediate treatment of the Incarnation as such. Moreover, one would place actually before the treatise on the Church a treatise on Mary, which is not present in detail in Aquinas. And if you read the commentary on I apologize, on the redemptive incarnation on Christ by Garrigou-Lagrange, he has a Mariology section at the end, a compendium, because he sees this. You've got to put in your Christology your Mariology, precisely because of the Theotokos, the Mother of God's direct connection to the hypostatic order because of her particular predestination. Well, all right, we've done all of this abroad. How can I sum all things up for the Summa and get us toward the end here and then inject us into the Prima Pars? But it's important to see the whole, because now you'll understand the radiance of why it's so important to study the Prima Pars. Well, I'll summarize it by saying, is theology one science or not? It has all of these things in it. For instance, I said just a moment ago, ecclesiology seems to be a separate discipline. You see, for the Thomists, no. Theology is a single science. The formal object, and even the primary subject studied in theology, is God. But it is God not merely as we know him through reason. It is God in his innermost mystery, sub ratione deitatis, as the later Thomists would come to say. From the formal perspective, we could say with the lens of the deity itself. And this makes complete sense if we see that theology is, yes, an acquired virtue. It's an acquired intellectual ability that we have by studiously reflecting on the mysteries of faith. But it is radically, it is in its root thrust down into faith, which give all of the sap to its discursus, to all of its reflection. This is part of the discussion that is undertaken in the very first article of the Prima Pars. And one could go and look, for example, at the questions that are raised there. This is, we could say, the great question of fundamental theology. Is theology necessary? Is it a science? Is it one or many? Is it speculative or is it practical? How does it relate to other sciences? You see, St. Thomas has this very methodical mind. He wants to say, what is its essence? Once I've done something about its essence, how does it relate to other sciences? Now, he does go on to discuss, is God its subject matter? So it's a little bit, I guess, less stylized than I was just trying to make it out to be. But the point being is that in this article, St. Thomas lays out the entire outlook that one should have for the enterprise being undertaken. For in theology, we will have truths that explain and truths that are explained, because it is a science. It's actually a sapiential science. It is a form of wisdom. Once again, go read that article. Otherwise, I'll have to drink myself to sleep. But it is a science, meaning that it's going to have certain truths that come first and certain truths that come later, truths that explain and are explained. And it's easy to miss the importance of this treatise. It's a treatise later on. It's a question. It's barely a treatise in anyone's mind, to be honest, who reads the Summa today. This is one of my great sorrows. I didn't know if I was going to actually get on this soapbox or not tonight, but here it has come organically. One of my great sorrows of contemporary Thomism is that after the Second Vatican Council, for a number of reasons, perhaps to be discussed in some later lectures that I'm going to give actually on the Nouvelle Theologie, the traditional schools got kicked to the wayside, which also meant that all of the development that had gone on, even for all of its weaknesses, was lost. And in the course of history, because of the increased pressure that was exerted against Christian thought by unbelief, slowly but surely, a treatise, and then really a set of treatises, developed at the beginning of the cursus of theology. Namely, the Treatise on Revelation, or which is sometimes called the Treatise on the True Religion, and the Treatise on Theological Sources, or it's sometimes named by the original title given to it by Melchior Cano, who was a Dominican in the 16th century, De Locis Theologicis, on theological places. He's actually taking out of the topics of Aristotle something here, actually. But we could say theological sources. Very important beginning treatise in theology to discuss the nature of revelation, to understand its supernatural character, to distinguish the mere rational, we could say, street cred of the mysteries, their rational credibility, from the supernatural assent of faith. See, this is the difficulty of any discipline. You have to start by presupposing so much, because the great meaning of our life, all these revealed truths are operative here. But I must reflect a bit and say, faith is supernatural, and explain that so that you understand that what's going on in theology begins with these supernatural sources, even though faith is not discussed in detail until actually the Secunda Secundae, the second half of the second part. And then after that, and after the discussion of what that apologetic argument looks like, very important part of theology, it is theology and faith using reason to argue against unbelievers, to show that revelation is indeed credible, that it is indeed worthy of belief, would be then followed by the treatise on theological sources, where you already presuppose now faith and you argue about the nature of Scripture and its interpretation and tradition, and the roles of the fathers and the councils, and then later theologians, and how history and philosophy are all used. This is all very important. And it's only by understanding that sort of thing that then you begin to understand, well, what sorts of arguments for God's existence are being made in the Summa? How is it that God's oneness is being discussed? And so forth. You then see the theological nature of the discipline that is in front of us, so that we don't go picking about there for mere philosophy. For this is going to be the thing we're going to have to keep trying to avoid when we start to now descend into the particular questions and articles over the course of our next lectures. So let us finish by considering then, just as I draw to a close over the next couple minutes, the breakout then of the Prima Pars. The Prima Pars is sometimes divided at the beginning into the treatise on the one God and the treatise on God as three, De Deo Uno and De Deo Trino. But here, following, for example, Jean Hervé Nicolas, I would rather combine those. And I think for good reason, and I think if you look at the prologue texts in Aquinas, it's clear this is the case too. That St. Thomas wants to discuss first what pertains to the essence of God before then discussing the distinction of persons. Because in order to understand the distinction of persons without destroying the unity of the Godhead, you must understand to some degree the unity of the Godhead. And so instead we have, perhaps we could merely say, De Deo ut uno, De Deo ut trino, God as one and God as three, but not the one God and the triune God. For it is the one God, it is God himself, the triune God, whom we are studying this whole time, that we are reflecting on in the treatise on God. And then we look at the economic order, the order of that which God does, for lack of better terms, outside himself, though he is present everywhere through his immensity, also especially present to us, of course, through grace, and uniquely present to Christ through the grace of union and his presence there. But still, there is a sense in which creation is here posited in existence outside of God. And so we have a discussion then of creatures, either creation as a whole, and so to discuss that and the distinction of creatures and the problems of time and duration that go along with that, because we can discuss God's eternity, but then we must discuss how time and eternity relate, at least somewhat. And then the spiritual life or spiritual forms of life, spiritual creatures. The angels will be discussed, and then slowly but surely we will then go down, but not to material creation at the end, but rather matter first, so we can do man, who is the kind of horizon, this liminal point where the light of spirituality shines while also matter remains with its penumbra, with its shadows. And then finally, having discussed the essence of these creatures that go forth from God, we must then discuss his providential activity thereafter. So we should look at this treatise, as I now draw to a close, if Michael is wondering about time. We look at this treatise as being all about God, the Prima Pars. But in particular, there is the De Deo core of the first, question 2 to 43, on God as one and God as three. And then the procession of all creatures from God we will discuss. And this will be, especially when you see above all the treatise on God here, it is the most important of all things in theology, because God in his inner mystery is the light and primary subject of theology as a science. For the Trinity is, in the end, the central mystery that explains all the others. For it is that divine life which is communicated through all the others. And it's for this reason that Cardinal Cajetan, in a bombastic phrase in his commentary on the Summa, said that it's most important to comment at length here on this section of the Summa, because if you get it wrong like Duns Scotus did, he said, well, there will be problems in all the rest of theology. Well, I don't plan to go at war too much against the Scotists in our time together, but it's very important to see the central and just absolutely important place of the Prima Pars for the rest of Summa. And for instance, one could never understand all of moral theology, which I teach, without having an appreciation of the triune life which is given to us by grace. Something I think is too forgotten by Thomists. And of course, the redemptive incarnation makes no sense unless one knows that Christ came to reveal the face of the Father, to send the Spirit to us, that we may be divinized and be remade in the image of that God who is studied here at the beginning of the cursus of theology. So with that, I would welcome the questions that Michael might want to bring.
Yeah, there's some really good questions here, but I want to jump in and ask one. What exactly was Cajetan pointing to when he was saying errors or the problems of scholars?
You know what, if you,
I gotta know.
Can I do your thing? Like, where you're typing there.
Yeah.
I need to pull it up. It's in Ralph McInerney's.
If you could grab that, because I'm curious, and I know everybody else here is probably curious.
If you can start fielding the question, I'll put the sound up here.
Yeah,
and I can grab it.
That's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
You can't judge me if you see I actually have to wear shorts today because I injured myself pretty badly.
No worries. No worries.
I'm bleeding my leg.
I think everyone who works at home now knows how it is. You're formal on top.
I refuse this. In March, I was a slob, but I'm not anymore. But I walked right into a pole in the ground when we were out hiking. It was like we were done. We were going to get ice cream, and it was closed. I turned around and thwack. And I mean, luckily the bleeding is stopping, but I don't want to get it on any trousers. So, but I'm going to go grab it while you're now getting the question, because it's actually right here. So.
And everybody, if you want, go ahead and put some more questions in the chat. Make sure to put it to @Reason in Theology so I can pick it out from comments and I can spot it really quickly. I see a few in there so far. Really, really good questions. We're going to get to them. But if you want to send a few more, that will be fine. I think we should have some time for that. So this
is a great book. So anyone who's, Professor McInerney, may he rest in peace. I disagree with him on certain things, but it's a great text on the Preambula Fidei. Gosh, it's as shiny as my glasses.
Yeah, but we can see it now. Good.
Let's see where he puts that. But he may have it under Thomas. It's Thomas DeVio. I named my daughter after poor Cajetan, or I shouldn't say poor Cajetan, but my poor daughter.
I always say, I know it Cajetan. I always say Cajetan from the Martin Luther movie. I don't know if you've seen the recent Martin Luther movie.
I haven't seen it, but of course, I've known people who, in their pedantry,
the the line that I can't seem to forget is the part where they tell Cajetan, he calls you an arse playing a harp, Cajetan.
Well,
And that's where Luther was drawing cartoons of him playing a harp, and so
this is so horrible. From what I understand, they present Cardinal Cajetan as this kind of bumbling. He can't keep up with Luther. This gets to me quite a bit because Cajetan was, if anything, his sin was that he was too much of a logic chopper. He was interestingly very open. Cajetan was to reforms. Actually, he was willing to grant, for instance, married clergy to the Germans. And there's a wonderful story he tells, and then we'll get back to it. But you know what? This is a Friday night. I didn't even have any booze, and I'm talking randomly. But Cajetan says at one point, he's recounting being at the altar saying Mass, and he's worked up at the motet that's going on during the Sanctus, and this endless stream of music going over top of each other. He actually was quite, he didn't like the state of ecclesiastical music. I mean, you can feel some of those like reforms, even that Pius X had to do with the operatic stuff around Trellus Licitudine. Don't worry, I'm no minimalist about the liturgy, but he couldn't take the kind of overlapped, music that happens in that sort of Renaissance era stuff. So now your poor listeners who are like, while I'm trying to get this for you, because it's such a wonderful, wonderful text. I just had hoped that it was in an indent here. I pulled up.
Well, if you can't find it, that's fine.
No, I will find it because I have Google Books up here as well. It's just that I have to, have my eyes land in the right place. So let someone go ahead and
okay. This one, here it is. It moved on me. This one is from Emmanuel Simon. Is the God known by philosophy the same God known by faith, i.e., the triune God?
Yeah, so this is a good entree for even beginning to think about, like, when we talk about the question on God's existence that will be taken up in question 2 of the Prima Pars. So when you prove something, this is very important in our intellectual climate, because we tend to all think somewhat like analytic philosophers, I suppose, that the conclusion is not as colored by the process of reasoning as it really is. So what do I mean? It's very tempting to think just in philosophy, and I'm going to answer you, don't worry, just in philosophy that, look, however you get there, as long as you can get to this conclusion, God exists, the argument technically doesn't matter. It doesn't change that truth that you've got there at the end. God exists. But let's consider just 2 of the arguments in Aquinas. The first way that and they seem almost the same. The first way concludes that God, based on the reality of motion, must be unmoved mover, perhaps pure act. But knowing God even there within that one, I don't even have to go to the second way, actually, which I was going to do. To know God as pure act, to say pure act exists, is what you're really saying, not merely that God exists. To say that an unmoved mover exists, which is actually the same thing. It's said at the first degree of abstraction, not the third, according to the Thomist scheme, because unmoved mover is doing the legwork in natural philosophy that then metaphysics will pick up and say is pure act. Those are 2 very different ways of knowing God. Like, it's not just the same thing. It's deceptive to see it in Aquinas, that God exists. And this is what I'll call God, right? Your conclusion is actually colored by the middle terms of your syllogism. Right? If your middle term involves some move that occurs, for instance, with motion, and how motion is not self-explanatory, well, then you're going to know God, you could say, kind of from the reflection of motion. And this can keep going in different ways, right? You can get all these different arguments to God then, by that are kind of structured on the fourth way, about God as highest good, highest being. You're also catching God out of the corner of your eye, so to speak. And you're going to do that with all the various divine attributes whenever you start talking about those as well. So that sort of knowledge is all analogical and based on your knowledge, of course, of creatures. And you're only kind of at the very terminus of your reasoning, getting this sort of very partial glimpse of God. So, of course, there are depths of God that are revealed by, revelation. And so the God of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? If we want to take the Pascalian opposition here, is still the God of the philosophers in the sense that it is indeed the same person or personal being who is tripersonal, in fact. Even though for the philosophers that God is, yes, quite distant and, to be honest, abstractly known. Although one could perhaps speak of a natural mystical experience that's possible as well of God's activity. But they are the same God. But the most the philosophical argument can do is say it's not opposed to being opened up by what faith then tells. That's actually the importance of the Treatise De Revelatione. The treatise that then expands that first question of Aquinas's Summa opens up basically how is reason open at these highest arguments to then be basically picked up and taken up into the revealed then truths about God. So yes, it is the same God in the sense that, we could say the same God ut res, as a thing, as a reality, but ut objectum, as an object known and even loved, because you can have a natural love for God, at least before the fall. Let's not get into that. I can feel things pressing in on my mind. As an object, God is quite different in both of those cases, but you could say that at least in true philosophy, it's not opposed to then being opened up to the supernaturally revealed truths. I'm choosing my language very very carefully, that non-opposition language, but we don't need to go into my reason for that. But yeah.
This one is from Contrasedificantism. What are the strongest arguments for foundationalism? Did I get that right? And against coherentism.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is going to be somewhat of a philosophical conversation that is a little bit, it's couched in analytic terms, right? And that's fine. I mean, I'm just a little bit I can feel that I'm going to perhaps not answer you directly, but let me attempt, because you're feeling, why are you saying this? Well, there's foundationalism in the modern sense, and that's how this is talked about. And I just was giving actually a talk with someone else for a podcast where I talked about earlier Thomist critiques of Descartes. Descartes was out for finding a foundation, an inconcussum fundamentum, a fundamentum inconcussum, an unshakable foundation for knowledge. This is actually derivative of Aristotle's language on the first principle of speculative reason in metaphysics, the principle of non-contradiction. It's the most unwavering principle, is what he says in the fourth book of the Metaphysics. Faith, what is known through faith, and here's the connection why this question I think is being asked. What's known through faith is functioning as these points of first principles, right? I would say that now it's going to depend a little bit from, philosophically what you think here. I think that you've got it's like a philosophical choice that needs to be made. Are there certain truths that are known without any further discursus of reason? Are there certain truths that actually you can't prove? And that's the Aristotelian position is, you have to kind of show, and you have to just show someone that, to be honest. That would be, actually, there you go. May I make a point? For Aristotle, if Aristotle had to prove the principle that there are first principles, because it is, he would say, at best, what I can do is I can show you through a reduction to absurdity that you can't deny that. It's called an extrinsic proof through an extrinsic middle term. You're doing a proof that doesn't actually prove it. You're just showing that it can't not be true. So that's the kind of argument structure you would take up philosophically to show that a foundationalism is possible. Now, in questions of faith, it may in a sense be easier because you can, I would say, argue on matters of faith that it's revealed that you can't reason to the assent of anything that's an assent of faith. I mean, that's just so obvious based on even by the time, something like De Filius by Vatican I. You're showing there that actually things that we know through faith have this kind of foundationalism feel because they're starting points, right? They are starting points that are believed because God has revealed them, not at all because we reason to them. We may reason to them being believable, being belief worthy by reason, but it's the experience of the Father who reveals that then gives that kind of foundation that way. Yeah.
This one, where is it? It actually moved on me. Hold on 1 second. It was around 653, I think. Well, let me ask this one, and I'll find the other one. From Benjamin, what do you think of parsimony as a methodology for deciding whether to believe in God? If you say God exists by necessity, couldn't one say that the universe exists necessarily?
Oh, well, question of free creation, I mean, you would have this would fall under actually the discussion of the operative attributes of God. And if I may, I'm going to make sure I revisit it more next time.
Sure.
Because whenever you talk about God as the highest good, and then you start applying that to his relationship, both the stuff at the end of the Prima Pars as well as some of the discussion of his will, you're going to see the non-necessitation of his will ad extra, that any finite good is not going to necessitate God's will. Now, I'd have to revisit the parsimony portion of that question. If you can,
yeah, here it is. What do you think of parsimony as a methodology for deciding whether to believe in God?
Well, to believing it's no methodology. The only methodology is for grace to move the ascent of faith. Right? You can, parsimony could be used as a methodology to kind of get bad ideas out of the way. But people can actually have a really bad philosophy and still actually have supernatural faith. But it could potentially work. But it's still not it's never gonna get you the illative, the discursive heft that would like jump you into supernatural faith, into a true belief that's the supernatural ascent that comes from God. Yeah. But more on the necessity of creation stuff whenever we start talking about the operative attributes of God, as well as maybe some of the providence stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. Now here it was. Must faith be presupposed in order to read and understand the Prima Pars?
So yeah, it's like yes and no. It's like in the strongest sense, yes. Actually, to understand it in its most profound moves, absolutely, because it's very easy to miss this. And I think people who have faith then read it without we read it without making our faith operative. I mean, I know how I would do this when reading like question 2. There's all this discussion of these proofs of God's existence that are being done. They're very much just the philosophical proofs. But you see operative from the beginning there. He keeps using citations of fathers in scripture, right? And that's because he's just kind of like picking up reason to let reason do what it can to defend the truths of faith. Now, that being said, there are these subsections. It's like watching the instrument, right? All these subsections where he's using the instrument of reason. It is reason and philosophy that's being used in Prima Pars and other sections too. The Treatise on Human Acts in the moral section. He's doing this extended moral psychology. I know people who, they're not at all worried about doing theology, but they get lots of philosophy out of there. Or like Rob Minor, not related to me, although I do happen to know him, wrote a book on the passions in Aquinas, and he mined the Treatise on Passions for discussions of the philosophical problem of the passions. But what you're doing is you're really paying attention to just the instrument. It's somewhat like, and I don't want to be too rude, but it's somewhat like listening only to the pipes in an organ whenever something is being played, because you really love like the technicalities of like tuning the pipes and how the different pipes sound. And that's great, but you're not then experiencing the song. So you could potentially, garner a lot of philosophy out of there, even if you're a non-believer. But to get the soul that animates the Summa, because it's one great arch all the way through. That's why I wanted to give this lecture. You need to have faith. Sorry, I'm looking at Michael. He's like, "Oh, your rhetoric is just."
No, I love this. This is very helpful. And this one is from Benjamin. Thoughts on presuppositionalism. Care to comment on that one?
Maybe the term I know under other words.
As far as an apologetic method, Van Til,
Oh, okay. Yes, this is interesting. So presuppositionalism would be the kind of idea that in apologetics that you have to presuppose faith in order to even have reason operative.
Right.
It's an interesting thing to see because you have veins of this in 20th century Catholic apologetics. It's not quite like, it's different than what's going on in someone like a Blondel, because that's a much more Protestant thing to be comfortable with, because you're going to want to say you're on the verge of something being wrong intrinsically, even with the natural capacities of reason. Now, you know what? Let me make some qualifications there, though, because this is a great question. Actually, this is a great question in the Treatise on De Revelatione. So what you have there is an example of a talker trying to quickly think through the issue. There was a temptation in the Catholic world after Vatican I to basically defend really strongly the rational credibility of the mysteries. So not that the mysteries are reduced to reason, but through especially extrinsic signs, miracles, the fulfillment of prophecies, that we can show the resurrection above all is the greatest miracle. We can show the rational credibility of the Christian religion. And then also too, through the fulfillment that we get of nature through grace. Christ is the loftiest moral teaching would be these sorts of arguments. This kind of argumentation tended to make it sound almost like you needed to have an argument for rational credibility before you could get to the assent of faith, or basically be there. And let's be honest. Thomas says here at the beginning of the very beginning of the Prima Pars, one of the reasons why there's a need for revealed truths is because it would take a long time and there would be a lot of error associated with our knowledge even of what we could know by reason alone. Reason has actually been affected by the fall. There's a temptation to only look at how the will has been affected, how concupiscence has affected our passions. But, St. Bede numbers ignorance among those effects of the fall that are classically known. Jacques Maritain has a very good end-of-life essay. It does some goofy, all of his stuff at the end of his life is doing this sort of like, I'm a 90-year-old man or an 80-year-old man writing stuff, kind of like going about. But he makes this, it's like a principle though. He makes a point that like just lit up for me. Grace, and I'm answering your question, I assure you, grace is in the soul after the manner of substance, right? It is a new nature. So sanctifying grace is down below the intellect and the will. And so when our first parents lost the grace of their state, Adamic grace, the effects of that actually are going to flow everywhere from the substance of the soul down, which means the intellect is darkened as well. And if the intellect is darkened as well, it means that even rational apologetics is going to have to presuppose on some level the activity, at least of actual grace, active in the receiving subject. Even though objectively the arguments you are making are rational arguments. Now, above all, the turn to faith, this is one of the reasons why you do want to distinguish rational credibility from the assent of faith very clearly. Still, nonetheless, apologetics that is doing anything more than merely showing the rational credibility is going to have to give up a lot to prayer and God to actually move someone to the assent of faith. But if you're merely trying to show that faith is not unreasonable, you probably do need a bit of presuppositionalism of a sort, because that's our state that we're in. And that's one of the weaknesses of sort of the scholastic background that I've been trained in. Although even in Garrigou-Lagrange's Better Moments, he admits this. He wants to say, we got to keep these orders separate. But he's like, yeah, it may be the case that for some people you need grace to heal reason. I'm willing to give more to that. I think Maritain's essay actually really converted me on that, the effects of the fall on reason itself. And just so you know, time is still fine because I can hear my wife must give my kids a bath, and I told her just put them down. So once they're asleep,
good, because I have one. So trying to think of how to phrase this. Whenever we speak about God and talk about his attributes, would it be better to speak about God analogically, or can we speak of him univocally, but just recognize that there's a shift between the finite and the infinite? Did I explain that? I guess.
Did my boss call you before this?
No, I'm trying to work through this.
My SCOTUS boss, Mother Christian Kappas.
No, I'm trying to work through it. So
yeah, no, that's fine. So here's how I look at this as a Thomist. Whenever you're applying a notion between created being and uncreated being, between us and God, be it the notion of being or goodness or unity, right? I mean, unity is a great example because for us, unity is is dispersed. Whereas in God, it's so, utterly one that somehow the opposed relations of the persons of the Trinity don't break it apart. That the very basis, and this is what's going to be really important here, the very basis of that comparison, you're both affirming and denying, right? Through a chain of reasoning. So let's just stay at the level of natural philosophy so we don't get involved in the whole question of super analogy. So if you're just doing, or if you're doing like natural theology in metaphysics, whenever you start applying to the first cause unity as an attribute, you're going to be both affirming and denying what you mean by unity in its primary sense for you, right? That it's the it's a lack of indivision in a creature bestowed upon it by its form, so that its matter is held together over a lifetime to hold it within a kind of single story that is its substantial unity, its history, so to speak, like as in the sense of like historia animalia. Whereas for God, it just means pure, like you said, it's like uncreated unity. That uncreated intrinsically changes the notion of unity. And for that reason, the abstraction of unity from its inferiors is not perfect, right? Unity itself is affected in the application to us, and it's affected in its application to God. Whereas a genus, which is the univocal case, a generic term that's univocal is going to perfectly abstract from its analogates. So you can't understand, from its inferiors. A genus perfectly abstracts from its inferiors. Animality is found the same in us and in dogs, right? In the sense that what we mean by animal, if we're being very precise with the term, is applied the same in both cases. Whereas unity itself is it can only be understood by going through that order of different analogates, those different cases of unity that it's involved in. And let's be honest, there's also the unity of spiritual beings. There's also the unity of of quantity in a being, which is different than substantial unity. It applies in all these different ways. Yves Simone's essay on order in analogical sets is great on this. It's a great essay. It's the best essay on analogy. And so, but that notion of unity isn't going to be separated out like a univocal notion. For your listeners who may be wondering what this is, a univocal notion is one where you use it with one meaning that applies to in the same way to both of the things that it's applied to.
What was the name of that essay?
On order in analogical sets. On order in analogical sets. The best Thomist account of analogy. Like I refuse to get involved in some of the discussions because I think Yves Simone articulated just so well because he did the problem itself. He was thinking with the Thomist school, but he actually went to the problem itself instead of getting overly worried about just like going through all of Aquinas' texts. It's a mistake. There's an old guy, and I really like him, Jack Cahalan, up in Methuen, Massachusetts. He said he made the cardinal sin for Thomists. Instead of reading just Thomas's text, he bothered to think through the problem, and he found the best Thomistic solution. So,
and there's also somebody asking, what was the essay by Martin that you referenced?
Oh yeah, it's in Untrammeled Approaches, which is like this essay set at the end of his life. And you know what? That's worthwhile for me to grab.
Yeah, go
ahead.
No worries.
No knowledge without intuitivity, I think, is the name of it. Actually, no knowledge without intuitivity. If you flip through the Untrammeled Approaches volume, you'll see something about like the effects of the fall in grace. It's the subtitle in the essay that'll come up. But I'm pretty sure it's not no knowledge without intuitivity. He goes in, he does like all this other stuff at the end, but that is really, pardon me, that's a really great insight about how the intellect is darkened by the loss of grace.
And real quick, because it reminded me of something I was discussing the other day. Would you say that Aquinas, when he talks about God as one, does he understand this generically or numerically, or some kind of combination of both? I mean, how does he understand that?
Yeah, because he's actually not using it in the sense it's fully it's not transcendental unity.
Yeah.
Right. It's actually I'd have to double check. I have to watch my language here because there's a scholastic distinction that is on my radar, but I don't want to misuse terminology. This is like a late scholastic kind of thing you don't see anymore. It's like it is numerical unity, though. I think is the appropriate thing to say. It's not because it's not with that quantitative sense of numeric unity, but he's not merely doing the metaphysics of the one. He is definitely talking about numeric unity, and that's a point that the good manuals really try to actually make. Is this is what he's doing? He's not necessarily just talking about transcendental unity. Yeah.
And did you happen to find the reference there in the quote from Cajetan?
Well, I thought I was, if nothing else, when we go offline afterwards, I'll have to go and look.
That's fine. We can do that another time and maybe
Well,
just.
it was just, no, I thought I had found it in.
No worries. No worries.
Oh, because it was. I know, but it was such a wonderful thing.
We can always.
Oh, here it is. Here it is.
Mhm.
Okay, so it is right at that beginning of the section. So, it comes from the late life essay Gilson wrote against something in Cajetan, and then Scotus's editors, McInerney writes, refer to a remark of Cajetan to the effect that Scotus had criticized nearly every word of the first part of Thomas's Summa Theologiae, singular prope huius partus verba. Now Gilson goes on, it's like, that's ridiculous. Scotus didn't, he didn't critique all of the Prima Pars. He just clearly didn't, if we look at it. Mm-hmm. But, and this is it, maybe, yeah, this is it. But John Scotus stands out from the others in this, that he labored with copious subtlety and indeed tried to destroy nearly every word in this part. But you know what? It's something else in that same quote that goes on to say about its connection to the rest. Because I think Cajetan's Latin is very difficult. So I think I remember looking at this whenever there was something in another book I was translating, because I was like, I don't know what that blasted Renaissance cardinal's saying. That's a fun enough quote itself, though, right? That with copious subtlety, he tried to destroy every word in the first part.
And for us who want to read some of these things, what did you learn to read? What did you use to learn Latin? What's the best thing that you would recommend?
Oh, yeah. Well, the way I did it, it's like, it's like the history of my calamities. I'll be like Abelard here, because I bumbled into it all, right? I used that ecclesiastical primer. First thing I did was I had it in high school. It was this distance learning program that used the Ecce Romane, or we would say in ecclesiastical Latin, Ecce Romane series, in a way for like someone who's at least a kid or a semi-kid. It works really well because it's natural. It does not make you memorize. You should never try to just memorize declensions, because that's not natural. That is not a natural way of thinking in a language. So my experience, I'm sure there are other texts like this. I don't know what McInerney's let's learn to read Latin is like. Actually, the more you can find texts that let you do that sort of thing, it's good. I used the Ecclesiastical Latin primer for like just 2 courses when I was in college, and then I ended up taking a summer thing at Notre Dame right before I went to graduate school that helped kind of put me over the edge, and then I just had to keep doing it. But what I would recommend is you then take texts like Scripture, the Breviary, and something like Thomas, because actually his Latin is so easy. You use texts that you already know the story of, so it helps you with the vocabulary and speak it. That's why I added the Breviary. Speak it. Get it on your lips. It's like this with other languages. Even if you're a little off, try to find someone who can help you with your pronunciation. But as long as you can hear, you'll hear cadences. There are things in Latin I actually sometimes can't explain. I have to go double check the grammar for, because I know what it is, but I'm like, I need to make sure that's right, because I hear it. And it's not because I'm some great Latinist, but it's because thankfully Tim Noon, my dissertation director, when I had him for classes, he so emphasized that idea of speaking it to get it in your ear. He would just make us read Latin from Scotus, which is really difficult, and he'd say, translate it, Mr. Minerd. So
I could only imagine anytime I've cracked open.
Very hard. It was very hard one time. And he said, no, it's okay. This is really terrible. His Latin here is very terrible. So
I can only imagine. Anytime I've cracked open Scotus, I'm lost. I can open Aquinas and I can follow. I don't know what Scotus is talking about, but maybe, there's some, foundational work that I need to do.
Well, so this may be the case. So for your listeners who don't know, John Duns Scotus was a very, very, very influential Franciscan theologian known as the Subtle Doctor. But he can be very difficult to read. And so the critical editions of Scotus have to have these headers to say who's talking, because he jumps back and forth. He starts talking about his opponent's article or his argument. And I ran across in De Revelatione just recently, book, the version by Garrigou, his treatise on Revelation, this great line. I sent it to a friend. I took a picture of my screen. because he's outlining Scotus on something. And then he just says, however, Scotus speaks in a somewhat obscure manner, and it's not always easy to distinguish what he teaches from what he merely is saying in objection to others. It's great. It's like he's just saying, I think this is what Scotus teaches, but
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I need some more foundational work before I can deal with Scotus.
Was so important, actually. Those later Franciscans, they basically had to clean things up. They had to make it more cohesive.
Is there an introductory material that we could work through to understand it better? Or no?
I don't know. I mean, because there is like this. There's a Summa that was done, the Summa Scotistica or Summa. I forget exactly what the title is, but it's in Latin. It's done on the model of Aquinas' Summa. But yeah, there's nothing in my mind that would. I wish you could get some stuff by like Antonia Andreas, even though like these things are developed, Scotism, but it was Scotism that lived first. Scotus, that going back to Scotus's thought is much more like now. The concern.
Who's the hardest to translate as far as a Latin writer? Luke asks.
Who is the hardest? Scotus is really hard. Duns Scotus is really hard. Among scholastics, Cajetan's Latin is very hard. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the hardest, but I find Cajetan actually to be hard. And there are others who say that actually about his style.
Why don't they? Why aren't they uniform in the way they, speak in Latin?
Think about it. It's different. I mean, it's different periods, right? You're in a humanistic period in Cajetan's time. I'm sure I could go if I start digging around humanistic Latin, it's gonna be hard for me because I'm not as classically trained. But this is the same thing with manuals too. So, for example, in answer to your question, I picked up Berthier, the guy I mentioned who he's a very German first name, so it makes me wonder if he was Swiss, if I remember correctly. But anyway, his Latin in his De Locis treatise is quite difficult for me compared to reading a French speaker writing in ecclesiastical Latin. Garrigue's Latin is French in Latin, word order and everything else. So, for instance, if I read Duranzo, he's thinking in English and writing in Latin, generally pretty easy. But for example, there's one other case. Vladimir Ledikowski. Yeah, there's a name you didn't expect to hear. He was he's the Jesuit superior general in the 20s and 30s, I think. Now it's probably classicized as well because he came from a rather noble-born family. His Latin was so tough. I had to go to Father Maurice Mount at St. Vincent Archabbey, who teaches classics there. And I had him looking at it, and Father Maurice was like, he's puzzling over it because it was so crisp and tight, and it did the minimal it needed to do a ton. Oh, that was a horrible footnote. He's going to get a free book here soon. I think it's in the order of things, actually. He's getting a free book merely for helping me with one footnote. It's like, and I said to him, I'm like, okay, I get it now. I see what he's saying. And Father Maurice is much more that careful Latinist who's declining things, right? He's a classicist by training. So he's like, no. He had to go get a couple more grammars out. Got to figure it out. I'm like, no, I see what he's saying. And I wasn't being flippant, right? I wasn't just saying, hey, whatever, I'll translate like that. So then he came back, though, and he basically explained to me what I said to him. That's fine. It's good. What I had was, I had an insight without a syllogism. He gave me the linguistic syllogism to prove that I was right.
Confirmed it.
So Vladimir Ledikowski, if you want to go read something, I guess I'll tell you that.
That's a new one for me. So, but I look forward to reading him in your book, which we're hopefully going to be able to do a show on in the near future. So everybody look for more on that. And did you want to put in a plug for anything else that you're working on?
Yeah. So, I am working on the next thing that's going to be more than likely coming to press. I've got a couple of things that are actually finally in copy editing at various stages. Both with the Emmaus Academic and CUA Press. But Sens Commun, or Common Sense by Garrigou, is going to start copy editing of its last stage with Emmaus Academic here in November. So that's the next guide that's going to come out. But we have The Order of Things, which just was released. So if you're thinking of ordering it, it's good to help the St. Paul Center out by ordering it directly from them, even though it's a teeny bit more expensive. I don't get a ton of money from these things. it's a labor of love for the church. You just don't make money on academic books.
Usually authors don't.
Yeah, exactly. Unless you're doing something popular, you know.
Right.
And even you got to sell tons. But you know, I do recommend, if you've got any philosophical chops and are interested in these kinds of things, you know, there are other people's volumes, of course, you can go get, but I'm doing this stuff too because I think these are great works. I'm not doing them for you know, just, you know, the sake of some polemics. I mean, these are my teachers, and I feel like the need to make sure they're in English and that they're on shelves, because they're otherwise just going to die as old French editions. So some of my work, if you want to take a look at them though, over at philosophicalcatholic.com, philosophicalcatholic.com. You can go see that stuff there. There's also the cocktail that I'll be having with my wife this evening. I have to use this violet liqueur. I just thought I'm going to make something with gin. And I'm like, well, I've got this blasted violet liqueur that I never make. So it's always the aviation cocktail. It's the only thing I know how to make with it. So, but I at least share a bit of that this evening. So
that's great.
I couldn't have a cocktail before this or with my talk because it was just I was far too tired today. So.
No worries. But no, this was excellent. I look forward to the next one. It's going to be on November 6th, which I believe is, that's also a Friday. So November 6th at 6 p.m. I'm pretty sure 6 p.m. Central. Let me double check it here. Just want to make sure that I got it down right. Yep, 6 p.m. Central. So everybody look forward to that, because that will be lecture 2 on the Prima Pars. Of course, we'll have 2 others after that, 4 in total. And then, of course, as you noted, you'll be doing some others as well. And in fact, we have you coming up on a roundtable, I want to say.
Tomorrow. I'm going to be around with you guys.
Isn't it tomorrow? Yeah, sure is. With Dr. Goff, Father Cops, yourself, and Nathaniel McCullen, all talking about the afterlife. So everybody tune into that. That is going to be at, let's see here, 7:30 p.m. Central. So that should be 8:30 Eastern Standard Time, if I recall correctly. So everybody tune in for that one. That's going to be fun. I look forward to that one.
That one's going to go, actually. So it's going to be, it's always kick a ball.
All right. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Minerd, and we'll have you on again. In fact, we'll have you on tomorrow, and then we'll have you on again November 6th. So once again, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
And everyone, thank you all for watching. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and share this on your social media. Check us out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you would like to support us. Until next time, God bless.